Late autumn, 1944. Rain drizzles over a quiet patch of English countryside. Beyond the hedgerows lies a compound wrapped in barbed wire. Camp 186, a prisoner of war site in the heart of Kent. Inside, rows of wooden huts glisten under the grey sky. German voices murmur, low and uncertain. Men in worn Wehrmacht coats line up with tin plates in hand. The air smells of wet earth, coal smoke, and something unfamiliar. A sound hisses from the cookhouse. Oil bubbling, knives scraping, and the unmistakable scent of fried fish drifting across the yard. Some prisoners exchange looks. Confusion, then disbelief. Surely not. Fried food? Here? They'd expected punishment, not comfort. A British guard, face impassive, ladles out golden fillets, thick-cut chips, and a spoon of green peas onto each plate. Steam rises in the cold air. The prisoners hesitate, then taste. The silence breaks. For the first time since capture, a flicker of warmth, not from the stove, but from the realization that their enemies were feeding them with care. That small act would change everything. When the first German prisoners arrived on British soil in 1939, they stepped into a nation both hardened by war and bound by principle. Britain, under constant threat of invasion and starvation, still saw itself as a defender of civilization, even in how it treated its enemies. By 1940, the fall of France and the Battle of Britain had brought thousands of Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht captives to British ports. Many were sailors pulled from the icy Atlantic after their U-boats sank. Others were downed pilots, captured paratroopers, or soldiers taken in North Africa. They arrived expecting the worst. Propaganda had told them that capture by the British meant cruelty or death. But Britain, even amid rationing and air raids, followed a different code. The government had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention, which mandated humane treatment of prisoners of war. Food, shelter, medical care, and protection from public abuse. Where Nazi Germany would later weaponize imprisonment, Britain turned it into a statement of national identity. Still, conditions in the early camps were grim. The first compounds were hastily built. Barbed wire, Nissen huts, and mud. Guards were often older men, veterans of the previous war, more weary than cruel. Rations were meager but consistent. Porridge in the morning, bread and margarine at noon, a stew of vegetables or tinned meat for dinner. Every ounce of food was weighed, every loaf rationed. To the German prisoners, it felt like deprivation. They whispered that the British were starving them as punishment. They didn't realize the British themselves were eating the same. The entire nation lived under rationing so strict that meat, butter, and sugar were luxury items. And yet, the difference lay in intent. There was no revenge, no humiliation. Prisoners received mail, could attend chapel, and even form orchestras or football teams within the wire. The War Office insisted that treating German POWs humanely would serve both moral and strategic goals. First, it upheld Britain's image as a just power, vital in contrast to the brutality reported from the Eastern Front. Second, it encouraged good behavior among prisoners, reducing escape attempts and disorder. And third, it sowed seeds of doubt, the quiet, psychological warfare of decency. By late 1942, the tide of war had turned. Rommel's Afrika Korps had been defeated, and ships began delivering tens of thousands of captured German soldiers to Britain. Camps multiplied across the countryside, from Wales to Yorkshire, each numbered and coded. Inside the fences, the enemy became a workforce. Prisoners were sent to clear debris, harvest crops, and repair roads. Rural communities began to see them not as villains, but as workers. Quiet men far from home, who bowed politely and worked hard. Still, beneath the order, unease simmered. The prisoners didn't understand British customs, especially the food. They called it Essen für Katzen, food for cats. The strange taste of tea, the absence of seasoning, and the grey, watery stews were alien to German palates. But the British cooks, following strict rationing and rules, served what they could. And among those rules was an old national habit: a Friday. Tradition that even war could not stop. Fish and chips, what began as a small gesture of normalcy for British guards, would soon become something far more profound. Because, when the smell of fried cod drifted through the wire for the first time, suspicion began to melt into curiosity, and then into respect. That moment of quiet transformation didn't come from a speech, or a treaty, or propaganda, but from a plate of food. By 1943, Britain held nearly 300,000 German prisoners of war. Camps were scattered across the landscape like hidden towns. Rows of Nissen huts, watchtowers, and muddy roads threading through farmland and forest. As the war dragged on, the British approach to these camps evolved from containment to quiet rehabilitation. Early on, the government feared riots, sabotage, or Nazi resistance movements among the prisoners. But over time, something unexpected happened. Discipline held. The camps became orderly communities, bound by rules, boredom, and routine. Every morning began with roll call. Prisoners worked in the fields, chopped timber, or repaired bombed rail lines. In return, they received fair rations, Red Cross parcels, and pay credits redeemable at camp canteens. For many, it was monotonous, but it was also survival. The British camp commanders, often veterans of the First World War, understood the fragile psychology of captured men. They knew humiliation could breed defiance, but fairness could build control. The War Office called it firm kindness. This policy wasn't born of sentimentality. It was strategic. By maintaining discipline without cruelty, Britain reduced the need for heavy security and violence. Well-fed, respected prisoners worked better, cooperated more, and sometimes even provided useful information during interrogation. But there was also an unspoken moral dimension. Britain saw itself as fighting not only for victory, but for civilization itself, a code of decency that separated it from the barbarity spreading across Europe. To mistreat prisoners would mean betraying that cause. That moral stance would soon become visible in the smallest, most human of gestures: food. Inside the wire, German expectations remained bleak. Their rations, bread, margarine, tea, tinned meat, were unfamiliar. Many complained of constant hunger. Rumors spread that other camps received better treatment. Camp cooks, often British soldiers or local women, worked within impossible limits, feeding hundreds from scarce supplies. Then came Fridays. Every Friday, across Britain, the Ministry of Food ensured the continued supply of fish, one of the few fresh proteins not subject to strict rationing. It was a tradition older than the war, a blend of Catholic abstinence and working-class culture. For British soldiers and civilians alike, Friday meant fish and chips, a taste of normal life amid the blackout. When the War Office extended the same menu to POWs, it wasn't an act of generosity, just adherence to regulation. But to the prisoners, it was astonishing. Imagine men who had spent months expecting punishment suddenly smelling fried fish and vinegar drifting through their barracks. To them, it felt like a mistake, or a trick. The smell of cooking oil, the golden crust, the portion of peas beside the chips, all of it seemed impossible in a prison camp. The first bites changed everything. The fish was hot, crispy, and unmistakably real. The chips, though thick and soggy by German standards, were hearty. And the peas, simple, green, sweet, gave color to a meal they thought would be gray forever. It was the first time many prisoners realized something fundamental. The British weren't trying to break them. The war outside raged on. Dresden burned. The Allies pushed through France. The V-1s fell on London, but inside the camps, this weekly ritual began to alter the prisoners' perception. They started to see their captors as human beings rather than faceless enemies. Some wrote home about it in coded letters. Others offered quiet nods of gratitude through the wire. The guards noticed the change too. Fewer fights, fewer escape attempts, more conversation. Food, more than force, had begun to win hearts. This small ritual, born of habit, not policy, would go on to reshape the entire dynamic between captor and captive. Because once the enemy breaks bread with you, he's no longer just the enemy. For the German prisoners, captivity in Britain was a descent into uncertainty. Many had been indoctrinated by propaganda, taught that surrender was dishonor, that the British were hypocrites, that capture meant cruelty. They expected to be beaten, starved, and humiliated. Instead, they found something they could not comprehend: fairness. Life behind the wire was monotonous but orderly. Work, meals, inspections, then silence. There was frustration, certainly, homesickness, shame, fear for families back in a bombed-out Reich. But the longer they stayed, the more the prisoners began to see the British way of life up close. They noticed how guards said, "please," and "thank you." How even in wartime scarcity, no one stole another's food. That Friday meal, fish, chips, and peas, came to symbolize a strange kind of peace. For men who had fought under the banner of conquest, the simplicity of a hot meal without hatred was disarming. It was the first thing that didn't feel like war. Some POWs later described the moment as the first time we realized we were safe. Safety, not luxury, was the true gift. For the British, food had always been more than sustenance. It was class, tradition, and identity, all wrapped in the comforting smell of fried oil and malt vinegar. During the war, rationing stripped most meals of pleasure. Yet, the national ritual of Friday fish and chips endured. It was democratic food, the same for soldier and civilian, rich and poor. When German prisoners were fed the same dish, it was not designed as a gesture of equality, but it became one. To share a national meal, even unknowingly, was to be included, if only for a moment, in the rhythm of ordinary British life. And that mattered, because while ideology divides, culture quietly unites. The Germans tasted not propaganda, but people. The flavor of a country that fought with restraint, that still remembered decency even under bombs. In a sense, fish and chips became Britain's soft power. Before the term existed, a cultural handshake across the wire. The decision to treat German prisoners well was not universally popular. Many Britons had lost sons and brothers to Luftwaffe raids or U-boat attacks. The idea that their killers were being fed, clothed, and even allowed recreation inside secure camps seemed like an insult to grief. But the British government, particularly the War Office and Red Cross inspectors, held firm. The policy was clear: to win the war without losing the moral war. Prime Minister Winston Churchill understood that the treatment of prisoners would be scrutinized after victory. The Geneva Convention wasn't merely a treaty, it was a mirror of the nation's conscience. Even under rationing, Britain refused to cut POW rations below its own. When supplies ran short, officials reduced both civilian and prisoner allowances equally, a gesture that, while unpopular, reinforced the sense that Britain fought for justice, not vengeance. The moral clarity of this approach had ripple effects. Prisoners who experienced humane treatment often spoke about it after the war, countering Nazi propaganda that painted the Allies as monsters. And when British soldiers later became POWs in Germany, many benefited from that reputation, because their captors, fearing post-war reciprocity, sometimes treated them better in return. In that way, every plate of food, every cup of tea, became part of a broader moral economy, an unspoken exchange between enemies who still shared a code of humanity. The huts, the fences, and the guard towers remained, but something intangible had shifted. The enemy had been humanized inside that wire. The smell of fried fish on a cold Friday evening meant more than comfort. It meant that the world, for a fleeting hour, remembered what civilization was supposed to feel like. It was a lesson neither side would forget. That dignity, once extended, has power even over war itself. The tactical angle on paper, feeding German prisoners fish and chips, had nothing to do with tactics. But behind the routine of meals and maintenance was a quiet, strategic calculation. The British understood that thousands of captured soldiers, many of them trained engineers, builders, and laborers, could either become a burden or a resource. Humane treatment wasn't only moral, it was practical. By maintaining discipline through respect rather than punishment, the War Office found that camps ran smoother. Guards faced fewer uprisings. Escape attempts dropped. Work productivity in agricultural and reconstruction projects soared. A prisoner who believed his captors were fair was far less likely to sabotage. That mattered deeply in 1944-45, when Britain faced severe labor shortages and needed every available hand to keep the wartime economy running. Even the simple consistency of mealtimes, especially those Fridays, established rhythm and stability. A sense of normalcy softened resistance and turned enemies into manageable human beings. It was psychological warfare of the gentlest kind, not by force, but by routine and respect. For many German POWs, captivity in Britain was the first time they saw the enemy's humanity. Some had been raised on Joseph Goebbels' propaganda, the image of a corrupt, decadent Britain ready to collapse under bombing. But here, they found order, politeness, even humor. It created dissonance. How could the people they'd been told were weak be so calm, so civilized, so sure of themselves? Food became the bridge. Fish and chips weren't merely a meal, they were an act of psychological reorientation. Every bite was evidence that the Reich had lied. In interviews decades later, former POWs described feeling ashamed, not because of defeat, but because they began to see that the enemy's strength came from decency, not brutality. Some compared the atmosphere of British camps to being treated as a man again. That transformation was subtle, but profound. A man fed with dignity begins to question the ideology that told him dignity only came through domination. In that sense, every Friday dinner was a small crack in the armor of fascism, one meal at a time. As the war dragged toward its end, many camps began integrating re-education programs. Lectures, books, and even films were shown to the prisoners. But none of it worked as effectively as everyday kindness. When you strip war of rhetoric and politics, what remains are ordinary people, eating, working, waiting to go home. And that realization became the quiet redemption of the German POW experience in Britain. After 1945, many former prisoners refused immediate repatriation. They stayed voluntarily to help with post-war rebuilding, harvesting crops, repairing roofs, driving lorries. Some later married local women and settled. Permanently, they had seen the difference between the world they'd been promised and the one they'd lived among their supposed enemies. A few even wrote letters to British officials, thanking them not for comfort, but for restoring their sense of humanity. One wrote, "It was strange to learn that you could lose the war, but win back your soul." That was the quiet victory, not marked by parades or medals, but by changed minds. The fish and chips served on those cold Fridays did not win battles or shift front lines, but they did something rarer. They turned enemies into witnesses, men who would go back to Germany with stories not of punishment, but of principle. And through them, Britain's moral legacy would travel farther than any bomb or bullet ever could. By early 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. The Reich was fragmenting under the Allied advance, and the trickle of captured soldiers had become a flood. More than 400,000 German prisoners now filled camps across Britain, from the rolling hills of Wales to the quiet edges of Yorkshire. At first, the British were overwhelmed. Resources were scarce, rations were tight, and yet, something remarkable happened. Instead of descending into chaos, the system held. Order persisted. In camp kitchens, stoves still burned, oil still bubbled, and on Fridays, the same ritual continued. Fish, chips, and peas, for guards and prisoners alike. It became a symbol, a quiet promise that civilization would not be lost in war's wreckage. But the true turning point came not on the front lines, but in the dining huts of camps like Lodge Moor, Eden Camp, and Camp 174 at Featherstone. At Lodge Moor, near Sheffield, one of the largest POW camps in Britain, tensions had been rising. News of atrocities committed by the SS on the Eastern Front had reached the prisoners. Some, still loyal to the Nazi cause, threatened others who spoke kindly of the British. "Traitors!" they hissed. Then came Good Friday, 1945. The camp's mess hall served the traditional meal: fish, chips, and peas. For the guards, it was a normal Friday. For the prisoners, it became something more. Among them was Obergefreiter Karl-Heinz Bremer, a 24-year-old Luftwaffe mechanic captured in Normandy. For weeks he'd kept to himself, bitter and defiant. But that day, he noticed something that stopped him cold. The same British sergeant who had arrested him months earlier, a man whose brother had died in France, now handed him his meal with a nod and a quiet, "Here you go, mate." Bremer later wrote in his diary, "He gave me food with respect. For the first time, I felt I was not the enemy, but a man again." That moment spread through the camp like a quiet revelation. The invisible wall between captor and captive began to crumble. In Scotland's Camp 21, known as the Re-Education Camp, British officers observed something similar. POWs who once refused to speak English began volunteering to work in the kitchens. They helped fry the fish, peel the potatoes, and dish out meals to fellow prisoners. One officer recorded in his report, "The men have found meaning in the simplest tasks. The kitchen has become their classroom." What had started as a pragmatic feeding schedule was now a social experiment, a test of whether humanity could survive inside barbed wire, and it worked. Camps that embraced fairness and decency saw almost no escapes, no riots, and no hunger strikes. Discipline came not from fear, but from mutual understanding. At a time when Europe was still burning, these small corners of order and kindness became sanctuaries. When Germany finally surrendered on May 8, 1945, celebrations erupted across Britain. But in the POW camps, the atmosphere was different, quieter, heavier. Many prisoners wept, not for defeat, but for uncertainty. What awaited them back home? Ruins? Retribution? That Friday, just days after the surrender, the mess halls again filled with the smell of frying fish. A British corporal at Camp 186 in Kent recalled the scene decades later. "They lined up, same as always. We served them, same as always. Only difference was, the war was over. We didn't cheer, we just kept serving. That was our victory." That calm, deliberate normalcy, feeding the former enemy with the same care as before, was perhaps Britain's most profound moral moment of the war. Because it proved that even after years of horror, compassion could still hold its ground. And in that quiet, smoke-filled kitchen, as the final batches of fish hissed in the oil, the meaning of victory changed. It was no longer about flags or borders. It was about character. The invisible line Britain had refused to cross, Even in victory, as Europe fell silent in the spring of 1945, the war had ended. But Britain's duty to its prisoners had not. More than 300,000 our sailors, German POWs, remained behind barbed wire across the British Isles. Many were now miles from the homes they once fought to defend, surrounded by the same men who had bombed their cities and sunk their ships. And yet, in those final months of occupation, a strange and deeply human transformation unfolded. At Camp 174 in Featherstone, local villagers began to notice something. Each Friday afternoon, the air around the camp filled with the smell of frying fish. British cooks worked side by side with German prisoners, laughing, exchanging words in broken English and hesitant German. Children gathered at the fence, waving, and sometimes, shyly, prisoners would toss them small wooden toys they had carved during the week. A farmer's wife later remembered, "We'd see them from the lane, cooking together. It didn't look like a prison anymore. It looked like a village." That image, smoke rising from the cookhouse, uniforms blurred by distance and steam, captured the quiet power of reconciliation. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't political. It was born from routine, from the simple dignity of being treated as human. At the same time, the British government was under pressure. Food rationing still gripped the nation. Civilians queued for bread, butter, and meat. Newspapers asked, "Why feed the enemy when our own go hungry?" But the War Office held firm. The Geneva Convention of 1929 demanded humane treatment, and Britain's leadership believed that moral authority was as vital as military victory. Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden had once remarked, "A nation that keeps its humanity in war keeps its honor in peace." And so the fish kept frying. Each batch was a small defiance against vengeance, against the temptation to dehumanize. In those same months, the first Red Cross inspection reports began to circulate. They spoke of model camps, places where discipline and decency coexisted. One inspector noted, "In Camp 186, the prisoner's greatest complaint is boredom. That, in wartime, is a triumph." For the Germans inside, the experience was bewildering. Men who had expected punishment found education, kindness, and stability. They read Shakespeare in English classes, played football on the grass, and wrote letters home describing a Britain that treated them better than their own regime had treated its enemies. For many, that realization struck harder than defeat itself. One former prisoner, Heinz Bruns, later recalled an unforgettable moment. "We sat in the canteen one Friday evening eating fish and chips. A guard came by and I said, 'In Germany, we called you barbarians.' He looked at me and said, 'Maybe now you'll see we're not.'" I never forgot that. Bruns would go on to become one of the thousands of ex-POWs who stayed in Britain voluntarily after the war, working on farms, in factories, and in rebuilding towns that had been bombed by his own countrymen. By 1947, nearly 25,000 Germans had applied for permission to remain permanently. Some married local women. Some raised families who would never again speak of the war as us versus them. That quiet assimilation, built not on propaganda, but on shared meals and mutual labor, was one of the war's most unheralded victories. But not all moments were gentle. In certain camps, die-hard Nazis still tried to enforce loyalty through fear. They marked collaborators, punished those who accepted British kindness, and whispered that anyone who smiled at a guard had betrayed Germany. At Camp 23 near Devizes, one such cell plotted to attack the kitchens, claiming the fish served on Fridays was enemy poison. But other prisoners intervened, protecting the cooks, shouting, "They feed us like men, not like dogs." That single act, Germans defending British cooks, symbolized how far the moral balance had shifted. The war of ideology was ending not in victory parades, but in a kitchen, over a meal shared in quiet defiance of hate. By late 1946, the POW program had become more than containment. It was rehabilitation, and Britain had unknowingly pioneered one of the earliest models of humane re-education in modern warfare. The fish and chips. Fridays continued right up until the final camps closed in 1948, when the last prisoners boarded ships home. The cooks came to the fences to see them off. Some shook hands. Others exchanged small gifts, a carved spoon, a photograph, a note. One British sergeant recalled, "They didn't salute. They just said, 'Danke.' And I realized, maybe this was what winning really looked like. From hatred to humility, from propaganda to peace. It all began with a meal. A plate of fried fish, thick chips, and green peas had done what guns and treaties never could. It had reminded two warring nations that decency survives even in captivity. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, Britain stood victorious, but exhausted. Cities lay in ruins, food was still rationed, and the country faced the long, grinding work of recovery. Yet scattered across the countryside were thousands of quiet outposts that told a different story. The POW camps, still humming with life long after the war had ended. At their peak, Britain held over 400,000 German prisoners, more than any other Allied nation except the United States. In the first months after the armistice, repatriation was impossible. Germany's cities were rubble, its transport shattered, and millions of civilians were homeless, so the prisoners stayed. But unlike the chaos of the continent, British camps remained orderly. Inspectors described them as self-contained, functioning societies. The same discipline that had governed them in wartime continued in peace. The British didn't celebrate victory with cruelty. Instead, they demonstrated restraint, a conscious decision to lead by example. Under the War Office Directorate of Prisoners of War, each camp transitioned from military containment to moral reconstruction. The goal was no longer to guard enemies, but to rebuild men. Work became the bridge between captivity and redemption. Prisoners labored on farms, forestry projects, and reconstruction sites. Their efforts helped repair bridges, harvest crops, and even rebuild bomb-damaged schools. Many Britons, initially hostile to their presence, began to change their minds. Letters from civilians recorded the shift. "They work harder than many of our own," wrote one farmer from Lincolnshire. "I can't see them as Nazis anymore, just men trying to go home." As the seasons passed, POWs began integrating with local communities. They joined village football matches, attended church services, and sometimes shared Sunday dinners with British families. The barbed wire remained, but in many places it had become symbolic rather than real. The Friday fish and chips ritual continued through these years, now more meaningful than ever. For the prisoners, it was a reminder that mercy had triumphed where hatred could have prevailed. Reports. From Camp 186, note that attendance at communal meals rose steadily through 1946-47. Men who once isolated themselves began joining others at the long wooden tables. The atmosphere, one camp chaplain wrote, was of men eating together as equals, not as captives. It was an extraordinary transformation. The very idea that German soldiers, once sworn to Hitler, would sit peacefully under British flags, eating the same food as their guards, was something no one could have imagined in 1940. But perhaps the most remarkable aftermath lay in what came after the gates finally opened. When the repatriations began in late 1946, thousands of prisoners boarded trains and ships bound for Germany. Many wept as they left. They carried with them not propaganda leaflets or speeches, but quiet memories. The smell of frying fish, the laughter of guards, the dignity of fair treatment. British intelligence reports later noted that these returning prisoners became the most stable and cooperative citizens in post-war Germany. They resisted extremism. They supported democratic reforms. They became living proof that moral victory could outlast military defeat. The meals, the fairness, the structure, all had left an imprint deeper than command could measure. By 1947, even the British public began to see what had been achieved. Newspapers that once demanded harsher treatment now ran stories with headlines like "From Enemy to Neighbor" and "German POW Marries Kent Girl." The war had turned into peace, not through diplomacy, but through ordinary acts of humanity repeated week after week, through food, fairness, and consistency. And at the center of that quiet revolution remained one enduring image: a British cook, wiping his hands on a towel, serving a plate of fish, chips, and peas. Not to a friend, not yet, but to a man who soon would be. By the time the last German prisoners left Britain in 1948, an invisible transformation had taken place, not only within the camps, but within Britain itself, the country that had endured the Blitz, fought across oceans, and faced invasion had emerged with something more precious than victory. It had preserved its moral compass. In total, over 25,000 German POWs chose not to return home. They applied to stay, to live, work, and start families in the same towns that had once feared them. Some settled as carpenters, bakers, or farmhands. Others became teachers or small business owners. In places like Norfolk, Kent, and Yorkshire, these men quietly helped rebuild a wounded nation. They repaired roads, harvested wheat, and built homes for a new Britain rising from the ashes. And every Friday, in many of those villages, fish and chips were still served. Not as a military ration, but as a family meal shared among people who longer remembered, who had once worn which uniform. Historians later called it the British model of moral victory. It stood in stark contrast to the punitive systems of other nations, while the Soviets marched millions into forced labor and starvation, and even France struggled with resentment toward its captives. Britain's approach was quietly revolutionary. It was built on three principles: discipline, fairness, and dignity. And the proof of its success wasn't found in reports or statistics, but in letters, thousands of them, sent by former POWs to their British captors. One letter, preserved in the Imperial War Museum, reads, "I came to your country hating everything it stood for. I left believing it was the finest nation I had ever seen." Another, written by a man who had worked on a Devon farm, said simply, "You taught me to be human again." Even decades later, the legacy lingered. Reunions were held. Former guards and prisoners exchanged Christmas cards. Some of the men who had once stood on opposite sides of Europe now stood side by side as godfathers to each other's children. In 1987, at a memorial event in Lincolnshire, elderly German veterans returned to visit the grounds of their old camp. The huts were gone, replaced by grass and hedges. But when the local community served them fish and chips for lunch, several men broke down in tears. One of them whispered, "It tastes the same." It wasn't nostalgia for captivity. It was gratitude for mercy. The true aftermath of those years could not be measured in numbers. It lived instead in memory, in the quiet endurance of decency during a time when the world had almost forgotten what decency meant. The POW camps had begun as tools of war, yet ended as workshops of humanity. Britain had not just held prisoners, it had reshaped them, not by indoctrination, but by example, and that example spread far beyond the barbed wire. When the Geneva Conventions were revised in 1949, many of Britain's wartime practices, humane rations, recreation, fair work conditions, became international standards. So when historians today ask how a meal as humble as fish and chips could carry such weight, the answer lies not in the food itself, but in what it represented. It was a statement that victory without compassion is hollow, that even in war, civilization must not surrender. The Germans who once thought British food was a punishment had discovered something deeper, that kindness, even served on a tin plate, can be more powerful than any weapon. And in the years that followed, as Europe rebuilt from ruin, that lesson, born in British camps and carried home in the hearts of former enemies, helped shape a new peace across a fractured continent. Because sometimes, the war for humanity isn't won on the battlefield, it's won at the dinner table. In the vast history of war, few victories are remembered for their mercy. Nations celebrate battles won, generals honored, flags raised. But the story of the German POWs in Britain tells of a different kind of triumph, one that required no armies, only humanity. The barbed wire, the watchtowers, the guards, they all spoke the language of war. Yet inside those fences, Britain proved that compassion could coexist with control. Every plate of fish and chips served on a Friday became a quiet declaration. We can fight fiercely and still remain human. Peter Norman Neeson's huts once sheltered soldiers in mud and fire. Decades later, they sheltered prisoners learning the meaning of peace. Within their curved walls, men who had followed a dictator learned that decency could come from the enemy they had once been taught to despise. It wasn't the food itself that mattered. It was what it symbolized. That the British didn't mirror the cruelty they fought against. That they believed civilization is measured not by power, but by restraint. From those camps came stories of laughter, labor, and redemption. Stories of men who discovered that losing the war didn't mean losing their souls. And as they returned to Germany, they carried those memories of fairness, of warmth, of the taste of fish, chips, and peas on a gray Friday afternoon. In that simple meal lay the spirit of a nation that refused to let hatred define it. Because in the end, the truest measure of victory is not how we treat our allies, but how we treat our enemies when the fighting is done. That is how Britain won its quietest war, not with bullets or bombs, but with kindness served hot, with salt and vinegar.